Okay, welcome everyone. So the title of this session is Diplomacy, Aid, and Nonviolent Peacekeeping and Protection. And I think we couldn't have any better presenters. You can see the full bios in the program, or if you're watching on the live stream, they're online. And speaking of the live stream, I want to greet our friends in Germany. Willkommen und ich hoffe, ihr hört gut zu heute. Hallo nach Berlin. So we have here Kathy Kelly, who is the co-founder and co-coordinator of Voices for Creative Nonviolence, and she has traveled. And I can stop right there with the introduction. No, she has traveled extensively with delegation to combat zones to witness the impacts of war. And when she is in the U.S., she is a tireless nonviolent peace activist who also writes and speaks about her actions and solidarity abroad. Next to her is Mel Duncan, who is a co-founder and current director of advocacy and outreach for Nonviolent Peace Force, an international NGO that not only provides direct protection of civilians caught in violent conflict, but also helps to restore the broken social fabric. So in addition to their remarkable and absolutely important contributions to a more peaceful world, they have one thing in common. They're as humble as it gets, putting their dedicated work ahead of recognition, careers, or wealth. So to talk about upholding non-lethal means to solve conflicts, I will turn it over to you now, and really you can introduce yourselves a little bit more, and then name a tool, real or imagined, that you think will need it to get to a world beyond war. And did you want to show that video? Okay.
Well, good morning. What a privilege to be in this room with all of you. Thank you very, very much to the organizers and to everyone who's come here to look at these very important questions. And of course, alternatives to war would essentially lean very, very heavily on diplomacy, on aid, and on negotiations, and nonviolent peacekeeping, nonviolent protection of other people. But what we're up against, of course, is so huge, with trillions of dollars of resources, human ingenuity, capacities being poured into what I would call the rat hole of United States military spending. And we are not only concerned with the war against the poor here in the United States, which has then manifested itself in the prison industrial complex. It mirrors the military industrial complex because both are entrenched with government salaries and corporate profit, making it very, very hard to uproot those systems. But we also have, I think, what should be called the military-industrial media complex, the media endorsing so much of the militarism. There are a myriad different kinds of examples we could give you, but one we thought we would call upon is from ABC News, September 2016, shortly after the Anaconda, they spell it Anakonda, I'm not sure, but it certainly communicates the idea of a fearsome snake squeezing the life out of people. The Anaconda exercises that NATO performed along the borders of Russia, as though, imagine if we had such exercises happening along the border of Canada, along the border of Mexico. Well, this is Martha Raddatz giving her cheer, I think. It strikes me as pure propaganda, her cheer for just this kind of militarism. Thank you, Patrick.
The meeting comes as America's allies in Eastern Europe face an increasingly aggressive Russia and fear further incursion like Putin's annexation of Crimea. It's a threat our next commander-in-chief will face, and we took to the skies over Estonia for a first-hand look at what the U.S. military is doing to counter it.
Here we go.
Taking off in an F-15 vertically. A backseat ride with the U.S. Air Force.
There we go, and the G's.
We're flying along the newest front line in a reignited Cold War, where tensions with Russia have steadily escalated. Russia unafraid to flex its muscles, buzzing U.S. warships.
We have 2 Russian Su-24s currently conducting multiple passes,
inching us closer to conflict. To counter, war games. The U.S. training with its European partners.
Our main goal as an air superiority force is to try and keep the enemy as far away from what we're trying to protect as we can.
Lieutenant Colonel Jason Zumwalt explains today's mission. 10 F-15 fighter jets split into 2 groups. I'm one of the bad guys.
We're going to ID you, we're going to target you, and we're going to make you go away before you can get to what we're trying to protect.
And when you say make me go away,
we're going to shoot an air-to-air missile at the enemy aircraft. They have a very good chance of success.
Not a real missile, but they are trying to replicate real threats. My pilot, Major Ben Liestma, call sign Trap, has been flying for 14 years.
You're training, but some real life thing could happen any minute.
We're prepared to handle that if required, and lucky for us to this point, we have skated clean.
Martha, we're going to go inverted here for just 1 second. There we go. Roll in left.
Back in the sky, a 360-degree turn. The dogfight is on.
Magic fight's on. We'll try to target them. They will more than likely target us first and kill us out.
Group 1, group bullseye, 2-0.
3 for 6 is dead.
Dog?
Yes, we got shot.
Okay, we got shot.
At times, pulling more than 6 Gs. The F-15s practicing precision air-to-air combat.
We're flying over Estonia now, and just over to the east, to the right, is Russia.
Moments later, we hear directly from the Russians, real Russian pilots. Over the radio, a warning, territory, territory. The Russian pilots cautioning the Americans about crossing their border. The Americans deny that, calling this just another provocative tactic. The mission ending without incident. This American show of force, a critical deterrent. As Estonians American-educated, President was quick to tell me,
when the world is tense, you see aggression around you, then you have to have real exercises.
What do you think Putin's intent is?
There's no rhyme or reason or logic to it other than perhaps to keep everyone off balance. I'm more afraid about some stupid accident. This is why being in NATO is very different from not being in NATO in this part of the world. Because of NATO deterrence, then they don't know what to expect should they do something, and that's a big difference.
One big reason why exercises like these will continue.
So that's part of what we're up against. And we also wanted to show you one slide, and then I saw that Bruce Gagnon had actually delivered one to every chair. But the chokehold of the United States military on Russia and China. And very helpfully, Bruce has already delivered that to you. And I hope we'll continue to try to disseminate this kind of information so that people will understand what we're up against in terms of United States militarism. So the alternative, diplomacy, negotiation, wise use of United States resources for, I'll just say the word aid, and then peacekeeping and protection. The role that I'm playing in this panel is to talk about unwise usage of aid. And I think the place where we can help our neighbors and friends and coworkers and others understand why it is that we don't trust the United States government to be engaged in aiding other people through militarized processes. I mean, as though this idea of humanitarian war could ever be anything other than an ugly oxymoron. The place where I think it can be so well understood and tragically understood is Afghanistan. And so I'd like to say a few things about experiences of a number of us dating back to 2010 in visiting Afghanistan. A number of us were there in 2011. And 21 major non-governmental organizations in Afghanistan had come together and signed a paper called Nowhere to Turn, Nowhere to Hide. They gave us an embargoed copy of it and said, please keep this quiet because we're sure that when it's released, it's going to get worldwide media attention. Well, the media treated it with about a total yawn. But in this paper, these 21 non-governmental organizations in Afghanistan were begging the United States military to stay very far away from any kind of humanitarian action because their actions were becoming jeopardized. Why? Because people so hated the United States military presence that they would kind of conflate any kind of humanitarian effort with United States militarism. Well, $104 billion, and now I actually just read in Military Times yesterday that it's up to $111 billion, more money than was spent on the Marshall Plan, has been spent on non-military expenditures in Afghanistan. $104 billion. When I'm there in the wintertime, there's electricity every other day. 20% of the people have access to potable water. The Taliban would seem to now be controlling close to 70% of the country, and the presence of poppy production is so immense that John Sapko, the head of the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, estimates that it would be 440,000 football fields, end size included, to calculate or give an analogy for the amount of land in Afghanistan dedicated to poppy production. But if you go over the charts for how the $104 billion was spent from 2015, they claim to have spent it on counter-narcotics, on improved governance, even though Afghanistan ranked with Somalia and North Korea as the most corrupt government in the world, and on humanitarian relief, including healthcare delivery. So let me talk with you just a little bit about this idea of United States AID, Aid for International Development, governmental aid for healthcare delivery in Afghanistan. John Sapko, on July 11th of 2015, delivered a blistering letter to the head of USAID. John Sapko is the chair of the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. I'd love to meet this man here in Washington, D.C. He's like a pit bull. He simply doesn't let go. His reports appear before the U.S. Congress 4 times a year, and he has detailed corruption. He has detailed the grievances that he has with the various U.S. aid operations that he says simply are either a waste of taxpayer money or have actually caused more problems than they were intended to create. So in his July letter, he pointed out that USAID was seeking U.S. taxpayer money to bankroll 641 healthcare facilities in Afghanistan. Now, in Afghanistan today, you can't just get in a Jeep and go drive to a healthcare facility in some remote province. It's simply not safe to go along the roads for many people, including many Afghans. And so maybe this gives people more encouragement to think, well, who's going to really notice if we ask for money for something that isn't quite what we said it was? Well, nowadays you can also use Google Earth, right? So using spatial imaging, John Sapko had his crew, once he began to get some doubts about these healthcare facilities, particularly after realizing that 6 of them were the X that marked the coordinate, located in Tajikistan. 6 were located in Pakistan. 1 was in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. So John Sapko said, let's look at all of them. And it turned out that 510 of these locations were questionable. And of that number, in 189 of the coordinates, X marked the spot where there wasn't a building in sight for 400 feet in any direction. So were these ghost hospitals? Was this money being invested in healthcare for which there was no oversight? Well, let's consider what happened with the Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders hospital in Kunduz that was functioning, that was the only available hospital for a whole arc across northern Afghanistan on October 3rd at 2:05 in the morning. A United States huge gunship began to fire on that hospital incendiary bombs and continued even after the hospital administrators had said, you're burning our hospital to the ground. Please stop. It continued. It went on for a half hour longer. I was in the emergency hospital, one run by a wonderful crew of Italians. I have O-negative blood, so they're always glad to see me, in Kabul. And I asked them, do you have any survivors of the Kunduz hospital bombing with whom we might talk? And they said, oh, sure, this kid will love to have some visitors. This kid was Khalid Ahmed. He was a pharmacist. His mother told him, don't go to work because it was so dangerous. But he assured his mother, the hospital's never going to be bombed. And so he was awakened at 2 o'clock in the morning and in great fear, seeing the patients he had recently treated burning in their own beds, seeing that there were laser-like bombs being fired at all directions, knowing that they had to take apart their cell phones because they knew that the United States technology was such that these planes could lock on your cell phone and possibly kill you. He was told by security guards, make a run for it. Khalid ran, and he got to the gate, and he took shrapnel in his back. He rolled himself into a ditch. He'd taken apart his cell phone, but in Afghan culture, you call your father, you get in touch with your father if you know you're going to die, and you tell your father you're sorry for anything you might ever have done to hurt him or the family. And this young man with the one arm still working, losing consciousness, managed to put together the cell phone, call home, reached his mother. His mother is beside herself, and he kept saying, I must talk to Dad. Put Dad on the phone. And very fortunately, when the father got on the phone, he said, my son, take off your sweater, put it under you to stop the bleeding. Where are you? And he learned exactly where Khalid was, and relatives lived nearby. They fetched him out of the ditch, and a 5-hour drive to the next place where you could get health care in Kabul. When I met him, he asked me, why would your people want to do this to us? We were only trying to help people. And Matt Aikens, really one of the finest war correspondents, I think, in the United States, wrote in a New York Times magazine response to the U.S. military report. And when the U.S. finally issued its report, its investigation of the Kunduz bombing, it said, it was a disproportionate attack against a non-existent threat. Well, weren't they describing every single war this country has waged, a disproportionate response to a non-existent threat? But what troubles me so much is Matt Aikens writes, for half an hour, the AC-130 fired its 105-millimeter howitzer, the largest airborne gun in existence, and its 40-millimeter Bofors cannon, which shoots exploding incendiary rounds and is ideal for hunting people who flee targeted buildings by foot, often referred to by pilots as squirters. According to the report, there were about 50 squirters at the site. The crew noted a surprisingly high number. Through the infrared scope, the building glowed as it burned, while ghostly shapes that flitted from inside were gunned down. Khalid Ahmed was, in the parlance of our militarism, a squirter. And so what we face, the entrenched militarism and the distortion, the disfigurement of humanitarian effort. I want to close by saying that we must not allow ourselves, however, to be lulled into the kind of hatred that we want to overcome. I think about Sinan Antun, author of a book called The Corpse Washer, a novel about Iraq. And Sinan Antun said that when war comes, it's like an earthquake. He said there were formerly fissures or rivulets that could have been crossed, but when the war comes, they become giant chasms, and they become like rivers, and the rivers become filled with torrents of blood, and it begins to seem as though one side can never be crossed over to the other side, and people on the other side become monstrous figures, and this becomes like a cement-sealed trap. And so let us never, never, never succumb to the idea of hatred for anyone, including the 1%, including the weapon makers, including the militarists. But let us say, as a military lawyer said of me when I last was in front of a judge and I was being sentenced to prison for 3 months, the military lawyer, I kind of wanted to go hug him. He said, Your Honor, Miss Kelly is in grave need of rehabilitation. And so I say, of all of these warmongers, they are in grave need of rehabilitation. Thank you.